Hi, everyone, and welcome to the debrief. Today we have three topics we're discussing. The Pope is recovering well from a Wednesday surgery. The US bishops are meeting this month, but the Synod on Synodality is not on their agenda. And shocking new developments on the nuns versus bishop story in Texas. In just a moment, Mike Lewis will be joining us on the debrief.
You know, that's a really triumphant sounding musical interlude, and I think we should do more of that. I think, maybe from segment to segment, or I don't know. We'll do it with the production team. We'll talk to them offline and see.
Once we get a millionaire donor or 10,000 donor. Anyhow, welcome friends to the debrief. It's a weekly show where we talk about news, questions, and controversies facing the Catholic Church. I'm Dominic D'Souza, the founder of Smart Catholics.
And I'm Mike Lewis, the editor-in-chief and co-founder of the website Where Peter Is.
So we have a story on the Holy Father recovering from his Wednesday surgery. Following his weekly general audience, it was announced that he'd gone to, is it Gemelli or Gemelli Hospital in Rome?
I think.
Yeah.
It's a G-E, it's Gemelli.
He had some kind of, a laparotomy and abdominal wall surgery under general anesthesia, but the Vatican press office reported the surgery went well and there were no complications. Any updates on that, Mike?
Yeah, so just to clarify that this operation was intended to fix some complications that resulted from his 2021 surgery. These are very common complications. According to Vatican News, today Pope Francis is recovering well. He's starting to use an armchair. He's reading the newspaper. They said as a standard precaution, he's going to stay in the hospital for 5 to 7 days, and his audiences are all canceled as a precaution until June 18th. So we continue to pray for the Pope. We continue to wish him well. He's 86 years old. We keep thinking, but he's got so much more work to do. So let's pray for a speedy recovery, and hopefully he will be back leading us very soon.
Fantastic. Now, you also wrote a piece on Wednesday tying the Holy Father's address from that morning's general audience, and he was talking about the missionary zeal of St Therese of Lisieux. Why do you think they're connected between that address and then what happened afterwards?
Well, so to start off, first, I was following this address very closely. He had gone to the hospital the day before for what they said would be a checkup. I assumed that they planned the surgery at that point or determined that he would need it, but he went forward with the audience. Now, I don't have any inside information. That's just my theory. But knowing that he was going to go to the hospital for surgery, I found it very interesting that he continued his evangelization on, or his catechesis on evangelization by focusing on St. Therese, the Little Flower, who was a cloistered Carmelite nun. Now, an interesting fact, and I've written about this before, and I also mentioned it in this piece, is that in the 1920s, Pope Pius XI named two co-patrons of the missions of the Catholic Church, universal patrons of the missions. The first was St. Francis Xavier, the great Jesuit missionary who traveled from Portugal to Spain, or from Europe to India to Japan. And then he died right before he got to China, but that was the next country on his list. And his zeal is fantastic, and he's known as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, Catholic missionary of all time for the number of people who came into the faith and the distance that he covered. St. Therese, on the other hand, never went on a mission. It was one of her desires to be a missionary, as Pope Francis talked about it. But why would they pick her? And this is essentially, it's the complementarity of the active and the contemplative life. A lot of people like to draw a distinction between Martha and Mary. Mary spending time sitting with Jesus, getting to know Jesus, while Martha is preparing the food and doing the work so that they can all sit down and have a meal with Jesus. And this is also reflected in Catholic vocations, which are divided between contemplative nuns who spend time in the cloister and active religious sisters. Some religious sisters have a contemplative element to their spirituality. It depends on the order, and vice versa. The level to which the cloister is enforced or is part of their spirituality is important. But it's very interesting that people who are bound to their beds, people who are sick, can play a pivotal, perhaps the more
Wow.
important role in the missionary activity and the evangelization of the church. And I think there may have been a little bit of a subliminal message there. Pope Francis is going to be out of the public eye for a couple of weeks. And he's still going, his heart and his prayers are still going to be with us as we evangelize out in the missions, as we, spread the gospel. So I know one other thing, I guess, to say is that these two things are complementary in that, and this was a line from the audience, was that prayer fuels missionary activity. And if you know anything about Mother Teresa, they start their day with morning prayer, mass, and adoration, and then they go out into the world. And there are certain points of the day where they switch back and forth, just like our friends in New Jersey, Sister Gabriella, and the Carmelites there. They work and they pray. That's what they do, and they have a life balance. So yeah, I think there was something very very strong there.
Prescient, maybe.
Yeah, and if anyone listening to this is homebound or sick or can't go out into the world, remember that God values your prayers for the missions just as much as those of us who are called to go on a mission. So
I think that's a fantastic reflection, fantastic meditation there. So we're going to come back to talking about contemplative nuns as our last story, but let's pause for a moment to talk about the church in the U.S. So on Monday, Brian Fraga of the National Catholic Reporter, he wrote an article about the fact that when the U.S. bishops meet in Orlando this month, the Synod on Synodality is not an item on their agenda. So some have said that it's astounding that they won't be addressing it. Why is that?
Well, for one thing, this is probably the biggest global initiative started by the Vatican since the Second Vatican Council. So in 60 years, this is a 4-year global process. Countries around the world, churches around the world are preparing for it. A while back, probably last year, I did some investigation into what are other continents and other countries doing to plan for the Synod. I looked at a few African bishops in English-speaking countries, and it was amazing where the bishop himself was going through the PowerPoint presentation and listing the priorities and the timeline and what the priests would be doing and what the catechists would be doing and what each parish would be doing. And then there would be this mass in the diocese and that mass in the diocese and this big meeting. And it was amazing to see this level of involvement, first of all, from their shepherd directly, compared to the US, where it seems that a lot of times bishops are defensive. Well, we already took care of that. We did what we were supposed to do for the Synod. And the focus, which this initiative, I believe, started after the Synod on Synodality was announced, is on this national Eucharistic revival. And there's some conflicts within there. Once again, to bring back this dynamic of the contemplative and the active, certain bishops have written editorials and given presentations. Some are saying that we need to stress Eucharistic adoration. We need to stress the real presence. We need to stress Eucharistic processions. We talked about Cardinal Supich, and I've learned a little bit more about those cross-country Eucharistic processions. And it sounds like what they plan to do is to have 4 vehicles. Someone nicknamed them host mobiles, sort of like the Pope mobile, where the monstrance is on display either in a window up above or somehow visible as it goes by, which is not really a traditional thing. Whereas others, especially some of the more liturgically minded, want to see a focus on the Eucharist within the context of the liturgy, which is the most fundamental work in prayer of the church, and then how that transforms us.
Mhm.
The Eucharist, through the Paschal mystery of the liturgy, transforms us and sends us forth on a mission. And it seems that they're talking past each other. It seems that certain bishops don't really get Francis's message, because I think it can be tied in very well with the concept of synodality. But for whatever reason, there's this discordance, there's this downplaying of the synod in the US. And that just seems like this go around, the US church isn't going to be a huge factor in.
So you went on to write a piece, and it was just this past Tuesday, and you entitled it, "What's Wrong with the Church in Your Country?" And you just touched on this a few seconds ago, but you're arguing the upcoming meetings are pointing to a bigger problem, the fact that the US church is an outlier in the universal Catholic Church. Why are we doing that?
Well, it's funny because ever since we started Where Peter Is, one of our founders, Pedro Gabriel, he's from Portugal, fluent in English, very familiar with American culture, American movies, and he's been contributing to our site, writing in English for essentially people in other countries, even though he lives in Portugal. He travels, but and he's always pointed out, or he's always said, I don't understand the church in your country, or why do American Catholics do this? Why do they do that? Last year, when I went to Rome, I did a 2-week visit to meet a lot of the people that I only knew online. I had some meetings set up with various people who worked in and around the Vatican. I met with journalists. I met with people who worked in the Curia. And one of the questions that people kept asking me is, what is wrong with the church in your country? Some of them, we're very grateful for the work that Where Peter Is does, because we have sought to translate what's going on in the Vatican and in the global church. We've sought to translate it for the benefit of US Catholics. But one of the reasons why we jumped into that void is because other US and English-speaking media outlets they didn't seem to understand the Vatican at all. They didn't understand Pope Francis. They couldn't interpret where he was coming from.
Mm-hmm.
And for whatever reason, this seems to be a universal issue with the Catholic Church. There are issues that are priorities in the US Catholic Church, or issues of debate. We talk about climate change, support for the death penalty in the United States. I spoke to an Italian doctoral student in theology, and we were talking about culture, and I was asking him about where he was from, and he was asking about where I was from, and we were kind of talking about similarities and differences in church. And he said, this is a question I want to ask you, and I don't want to offend you, but I can't enter into the mind of a Catholic supporting the death penalty. Imagine that. People who are listening right now who are from the US, it's like a live issue. We have Catholic governors promoting it. We have Catholic priests promoting it. We have big time, supposedly Orthodox Catholic publishers publishing thick books defending the death penalty. We have people openly saying that Pope Francis's teaching is only a prudential issue, and that it's not binding. If you look at the issue of climate change, yes, there can be differences in policy or how to address it. But the way that I look at certain things like science is, I'm not a scientist. I'm not an expert. I'm not an authority in the area of science. And this is what the church, this is what the Pope always does, is, okay, the Pope isn't an expert on science, so who does he turn to? He turns to the most qualified, most respected scientists in the world. And if the people who are studying the climate overwhelmingly accept that humans are causing climate change, who am I to say, no, I believe this guy on YouTube? I am not an authority. I can't analyze the data. I'm incapable of that. I have a bachelor's in English language and literature, and I have a master's in publishing. Like, analyzing raw data from satellites and ice flows and things like that is not something that I am capable of doing. So I have, when we don't know something, and it's a matter of trust. We have to, what we can do is we can use our critical thinking skills to determine who is most likely to give us the best, most reliable information on this question.
Yeah.
And I think Pope Francis led the way. And I think that this is typical in most countries, especially among Catholics. But for some reason in the United States, there's this contrarian attitude, or this attitude that we're going to go against the flow on something that we don't know anything about because my ideological allies agree with me. And so I think it's a matter of distrust just as much as trust. Obviously, you have to earn trust, but when people are giving trust to people who are equally unqualified, it makes you wonder. I think it speaks to a bigger problem in the U.S. Church, and it's something that I've sought to address. But this was Brian's article in NCR, I think, was a good opportunity to point to how the U.S. bishops just don't seem to be on board with what Pope Francis is doing. And I don't think some of them even conceptualize what that is. Like when people are accused of like when prominent Catholics are accused of not supporting Pope Francis, or of being anti-Francis, and they're like, well, what do you mean? I'm in communion with him. I quoted him favorably. I don't say mean things about him. And that's not what I mean. Now, maybe you're not anti-Francis, but being polite about the Pope and paying courtesy to the Pope doesn't mean you're supporting the Pope.
Thoroughly ignoring him at the same time doesn't, yeah.
So
Speaking of distrust, then, our last story has a whole lot of, well, I don't know, lines have been drawn and people are sinking their teeth into things. We touched on this last week, the dramatic conflict between Bishop Michael Olson of Fort Worth and the cloistered Carmelite nuns of his diocese. And you said that the only way this story makes sense is if Bishop Olson and the Vatican have evidence against the prioress, Mother Teresa Agnes of Jesus Crucified, Gerlach, evidence that we don't know about. Seems that there has been a very shocking twist to this story. So can you get us caught up to that this week?
Yes. Well, I don't know if I'm a prophet, but the way Bishop Olson was acting, and now plenty of people can say he didn't handle it right, he was rude, he wasn't communicating properly. But unless he and the Vatican officials in Dickelcell, the dicastery for religious life, unless they were completely illogical and out of their minds, there had to be some kind of compelling evidence that we weren't hearing about. And so then yesterday morning, I wake up to an email from a reader, and there's this story in the Fort Worth paper, and we'll link to it, showing two photographs of really messy tables in what looked like a storage room or a workroom, and they were covered, I am told, I didn't recognize them, but plenty of people did, with cannabis packages and edibles and basically various marijuana products, a large number of marijuana
and the
products.
Understanding is that this is at the Carmelite.
And so it was said that this was a confidential informant who sent these pictures to the diocese. There's also a huge bong on one of the tables. This is apparently one of the rooms within the monastery. Now, once again, the diocese hasn't given us a ton of information about what this indicates. You know, I don't know if this means that they think that one of the nuns has a drug problem. It could mean that they're running a drug cartel from the monastery. Like
No
We're going to talk about that in a
explanation.
second, but
Okay.
these pictures are obviously shocking. This is much more to the story than vague allegations about the prioress breaking the sixth commandment. So this is a big revelation.
Has she responded to this?
Yes. So her lawyer this morning stated that the entire thing was fabricated. It was fake. It didn't happen.
Okay. Do we know who sent the article to, was it yahoo.com where it...
Well, so it was the Fort Worth paper, and I believe finally the archdiocese or the diocesan spokesman released the pictures, answered a few questions in the press, said there's more information, but Bishop Olson will determine when it's right to do that. Okay. One of the things that surprised me, however, when I posted this article on Twitter, was I would say that a good 80% of the people who responded to it across the spectrum, like this is almost a unifying issue for some Catholics, was still to support the nuns. A lot of them either thought it was fake or that it was misunderstood. But even some of them said, well, you know what? Even if it's true, the bishop still shouldn't have done this and this and this and this, or come up with some other
default
explanation.
Response is to dislike or to negate the hierarchy.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to the communication in the church.
And you wrote actually an article in this, maybe this morning, discussing this case and how it's emblematic then of church communications. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so basically what I noticed, and the reason why I predicted there was more information last week was because I worked for the church for 9 years. I've been following the church for another 5 or 6 years on top of that. And I've become used to the church's style of communication when there's a big scandal. And I don't think it's necessarily a good thing. Last time I mentioned the issue with Fisher Moore College in the same diocese in Fort Worth, and Bishop Michael Olson was making all of these unexplained decisions seeming to persecute them. And then all of a sudden, a few months later, all of these issues poured out, and it seems like he was justified in the end. But there are other issues. This is just what the church does. They allow a media narrative to build up, and for whatever reason, they choose absolute silence as their reaction. So obviously, in this issue of the nuns and Bishop Olson knew there was a problem. He started to investigate it. He started to sanction the nuns. After they sued him, he stopped sending priests to do daily mass for them. They only got Sunday mass. These different restrictions, these different threats. And all we were getting from him were these public statements, while the nuns, their supporters, their lawyer are putting out a huge narrative about what's going on against the bishop. And he's not defending himself. He's not making any statements. He's not even making statements to the effect of, there is much more to this story. Unfortunately, due to confidentiality, canon law, I don't know what the reason is.
Yeah.
I can't talk about it. And I raised
it's like 101 when the police department has like a case going on. They sit up and they say, it's an ongoing investigation, no comment, or something. At the very least, a recognition of the issue, right?
Yeah, and people get used to it. But when it comes to the church, they don't get used to it because there's so much distrust of the bishop. There's so little credibility. I want to take you back to...
That's kind of your point, right? You say that this style of communication is harming the church's credibility. Can you unpack that?
I mean, if you go back to 2018 when the McCarrick scandal broke, obviously it's a big deal. Pope Francis puts out a letter. This all happens, in June. The Vigano thing happens in August. There's a little bit of a Vatican response. Pope Francis says he's not going to speak on it. But the thing is, the Vatican would wait every couple of months to do anything or to say anything. I remember when it first happened, they say, they said, when are they going to kick McCarrick out of the College of Cardinals? And this question kept being asked and asked and asked. The Vatican didn't respond. There was, some journalists were speculating that it was going to happen, or maybe they had some unofficial information off the record that it was going to happen. Then all of a sudden, one day, boom, an official letter that McCarrick has withdrawn from the College of Cardinals, and Pope Francis has accepted it. Then after that, it was, when are they going to defrock McCarrick? Like, people demanded these answers. And so beginning in maybe August or September, they're asking this question on a daily basis. Vigano's doing his thing, different speculative reports and conspiracy theories and all kinds of things about how Francis collaborated with Vigano. All of those kinds of things were coming out in the public. Other people were just concerned. Why isn't the church doing anything? Why aren't they saying anything? Well, the truth is that Cardinal McCarrick was undergoing the process. Everyone's entitled to a fair trial. He went through the entire canonical trial. Maybe he appealed. Maybe there were some negotiations about what the terms were going to be. Then early the following year, the announcement comes out that he has now been laicized. But in the meantime, all of this anger built up. Then we're told, or then the issue became, when are you going to release the McCarrick report? Because at one point they said, next year we're going to release the full McCarrick report that'll say everything that went wrong. We're going to analyze it. And I remember following this very closely and talking to everyone I knew in and around the Vatican. When is this McCarrick report going to come out? Here I am. I'm trying to defend Francis, or at least present his point of view, and I'm getting no information. I think they said it was going to come out in like May 2019. It doesn't come out until November 2020. It comes out with very little notice, like 24 hours, if that. Yeah. But this is the kind of thing. It's like, I understand if there are certain things that need to be confidential, but when the church's answer is silence, the impression that it gives to people is that the church doesn't care or the church isn't doing anything. Yeah. Another example, and I just want to point to this, is the case of Frank Pavone, founder of Priests for Life. He was a very vocal, bombastic, in the last 7 or 8 years, political figure. He had run into trouble with a couple of bishops. He was incarnated in the Diocese of Amarillo, Texas, but he lived and worked out of Orlando. And then in 2016, right before the election, he pulls this stunt. He makes a video where he takes the corpse of an aborted baby and puts it on an altar and does a campaign benediction for Donald Trump, which priests aren't supposed to be partisan in the first place, but to do something like this. So November 2016, his bishop, Bishop Zubik of Amarillo, wrote a public statement saying that he was going to launch an investigation on Father Pavone. Over the next 6 years, Father Pavone, he got involved in the 2020 election. He became even more political. He became even more outspoken. Social media, he was all over the place. He was claiming that he was transferring to another diocese, and that was in effect. All of this stuff happens over 6 years. People were calling the bishop. Some people could get maybe some information like he's not a priest in good standing, but he's in our diocese. But beyond that, was anything happening? Who was doing something? Then out of the blue, last December, a letter is released from the Diocese of Amarillo announcing that Father Pavone had been defrocked. He was, and not only that, it had happened a month earlier. So they didn't announce it at the time, and it explained he had ample opportunity to defend himself. All appeals had been exhausted, and that it was a permanent decision, and it was final. We have no information about how that trial went on. We have no, and that whole time, there was nothing public that this was really taking place. Now, I understand that a lot of this is covered by what's called pontifical secrecy. There are canon law says to keep things confidential under certain reasons. And this is done in a lot of cases for honorable reasons. In a lot of cases, it's resorting to gossip, or I think some of the idea is that somebody is entitled to their good name until they're proven guilty.
Yeah.
But if we're completely in the dark as to whether the church is even
doing anything, yeah.
I mean, I don't know if we've talked about Vos Estis, Lex Mundi before. It's this document that came out in 2018 or 2019. It deals with bishops who have either covered up abuse or who have been abusers themselves, which was a big gap in canon law and the protocols dealing with abuser priests. It was a big deal. They put it out. And then, well, for one thing, it was a 3-year thing. The 3 years expired, which meant that it was technically, there was no law anymore. But then it was reinstated, and now it's a permanent law. But it's like they didn't explain that gap other than the fact that it lapsed. But here's the other thing. We don't know how Vos Estis Lex Mundi is doing because no one ever tells us from the Vatican, from official church sources, which bishops are being investigated. I mean, sometimes we'll see that a bishop has announced his retirement at the age of 59, or we'll see that a bishop has been kicked out of his diocese, and journalists will try to get the scoop, and they'll put it together and they'll say such and such bishop was found guilty of this and this under Vos Estis, but there's nothing from the Vatican. And here's the other thing: they talk about certain bishops who, I know we read in the Pillar a lot that such and such bishop is reportedly under investigation by Vos Estis. Well, here's the problem: if they're exonerated, we never hear anything at all. It's as if it never happened. I mean, it's in some archive somewhere that future generations maybe can study what went on. But if we hear a scandal about a bishop who is potentially involved in a cover-up, we get no follow-up. We never hear that, oh yeah, the Vatican looked into it. And granted, they have a right to their good name. But if their good name has been stripped away by the media and people are looking at the Vatican as being complicit in ignoring it, even though they have been active, I think the church needs to reconsider how it deals with issues that are confidential. What is confidential now that morally doesn't need to be confidential. And I think accessibility is very important. Is the bishop looking into this? I mean, this is at the Vatican and the chancery level. My priest did this horrible thing, report him to the bishop, and then that's the last you hear of it. Was it true? Was it investigated? Was it ignored? And this is something that people keep running into. And I don't know if it's a desire to avoid work. It could be somebody's working very diligently behind the scenes, but we don't really get that information. And I think some of it would be preferable, even morally, to share with the faithful. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that. But
It makes sense to me. It has been such a point of difficulty. Like you said, it makes them seem like they're either ignoring it or culpable. So even some kind of static, statement would.
It wouldn't. I don't think it should be static. I think it should be dialectic.
I meant like a point of recognition.
Yeah. Oh yeah, but it's one of those things where the Vatican will occasionally say, there's something that happened 10 years ago, and they'll issue an update in 2019. And then in 2023, people are saying, well, the last update was in 2019. Well, what happened to it? And the fact is, and this is the problem, I think in some cases, the issue just does die.
It did die for a while.
The Vatican just puts things to the side and nobody is working on it. If there's a change in Pope, if there's a change in prefect, if there's a change in bishop, maybe some of these issues do die. They'll say they're looking into something, but then it doesn't get looked into. And I think this lack of updating or of at least reassuring people that this is still on your radar is well worth doing. I mean, one other story was, speaking of the USCCB meetings, there was a report in Religion News Service by Jack Jenkins on an altercation or an interaction between the papal nuncio and Bishop Strickland of Tyler, Texas, back in 2021 at the Baltimore meeting. Bishop Strickland's radio partner, Terry Barber, happened to blurt it out on the radio that, details that this discussion had happened. And Jack Jenkins tweeted that this is very rare. Now, I don't know if there's an investigation or a visitation or anything going on with Bishop Strickland right now, but it's extremely rare to have any glimpse that the church is actually doing something about its problems.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a good place to wrap. And if people want to check these links and these posts that have gone out on wherepeteris.com, they are in the show notes. Next week, we promise to talk about the Vatican document on engagement with social media that was just recently released. It keeps being trumped by these other topics, but also we want to cover the highlights of the document and what people in the church are saying about it. And like with any document the Holy Father publishes, nobody reads it until a long time later. So we are canvassing for some of that, different opinions, different feedback. So next week we do plan to come back to that one. Thanks again, Mike, for coming on to the debrief. I personally always appreciate the extra context that you provide to an issue. So I find that very valuable. A reminder, available links to these topics are in the description. The conversation is brought to you from smartcatholics.com. It's the free online community for millennials, creators, and learners. Join our private Where Peter Is group to ask questions, share insights, and suggest topics for next time.
And of course, visit wherepeteris.com to read articles, commentaries, and spiritual reflections for faithful Catholics who support the mission and vision of Pope Francis.
Do share the episode with family or friends. Hit the subscribe button and the like button so that you never miss an episode of The Debrief.
And please support Where Peter Is on Patreon to help us continue bringing you this show.
Thanks for joining us, friends.
Just wanted to add, sorry to interrupt. I think we, some of us in the leadership team for Where Peter Is, in the next week or two or until the end of July, are going to be putting our heads down and trying to get organized a little bit more. So stay tuned for more announcements, but we appreciate our sponsors and you will be hearing more from us soon.
Fantastic. Good. Thanks for joining us. When it comes to news and controversies in the Catholic Church, stay curious, informed, and engaged. God bless you.